The air in the penthouse suite was always a crisp, almost sterile chill, even when the Californian sun blazed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panorama of Los Angeles. That chill, however, was nothing compared to the ice that had begun to form around my heart the day Julian walked back into my life, a stranger wearing the face of the man I had loved, and lost, and loved again with a desperation that bordered on madness. My name is Elara Vance, though for the last 2 years, I had been just Elara, a ghost in the periphery of the towering empire that Julian Thorne commanded. I remember the day he left, or rather, the day he forgot, with a clarity that still steals my breath in the quiet moments before dawn. It wasn't a dramatic exit, no slammed doors or thrown objects, it was far worse, far colder, a calculated erasure executed with the precision of a man who believed I was nothing more than an unfortunate smudge on his otherwise perfect ledger. It had been 3 years since the accident, a senseless, brutal pile-up on the Pacific Coast Highway that had left Julian in a coma for 6 agonizing weeks and, upon waking, had surgically excised the last 5 years of his memory. 5 years that contained our secret wedding in a tiny, sun-drenched chapel in Tuscany, the messy, passionate development of his burgeoning tech empire, and me, Elara, his confidant, his anchor, the woman he'd sworn he couldn't live without. When he awoke, he remembered the boardrooms, the mergers, the ruthless ascent to billionaire status, but he didn't remember the quiet evenings, the shared jokes that needed no explanation, or the ring box hidden under the loose floorboard in our first shared apartment. When he came home, he looked at me with the polite, distant curiosity reserved for a new, overly efficient personal assistant. "You must be Elara," he'd said, his voice deeper, more resonant than I remembered, yet utterly devoid of recognition. "My lawyers mentioned you handled domestic arrangements." Domestic arrangements. That was what 2,000 nights of shared existence had been reduced to. He was Julian Thorne, the titan, the genius, and I, Elara, was merely the competent fixture keeping his massive, empty house running smoothly while he rebuilt the narrative of his life, a narrative that conveniently excluded the inconvenient, messy truth of our love. The initial weeks were a study in excruciating politeness. I moved through the penthouse like a well-oiled machine, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, a habit ingrained from years of knowing his every flicker of mood. I ordered his specific blend of Ethiopian coffee, ensured his bespoke suits were pressed to military perfection, and scheduled his charity galas. He treated me with a detached respect that cut deeper than any shouted accusation. He never called me by my first name unless absolutely necessary, always defaulting to a formal MS. Vance. I watched him navigate the world, this brilliant, cold man who possessed everything but the essential piece of his own past, and I was trapped on the outside, the keeper of a history he no longer valued. The breaking point came during a dinner with the board members. I was serving the wine, a rare vintage Julian had insisted upon before the accident, when one of the directors, a woman named Veronica Sterling, leaned in close to Julian and whispered something that made him laugh, a genuine, unrestrained sound that echoed the Julian I knew. Later that evening, as I was clearing the crystal glasses, Julian stopped me near the entrance to the dining room. "Elara," he said, his gaze sharp, analyzing. "You seem familiar with my routines. Almost too familiar." My practiced composure nearly fractured. "I've worked for you for a long time, Mr. Thorne. Since before the accident, I understand." He frowned, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. "It's not just that. There's a tension around you. A sort of expectation. You look at me as if I owe you something." The words were daggers, expertly aimed. He was sensing the ghost of our intimacy, the weight of my unacknowledged grief, and he interpreted it as entitlement. "I assure you, Mr. Thorne," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady, "my dedication is strictly professional. Perhaps the change in your routine is disconcerting for everyone." He studied me, his eyes, the color of polished obsidian, searching for something that wasn't there for him. "Perhaps. You're very beautiful, Elara, in a severe, almost tragic way. But I need clarity, not history. If there's any personal baggage you're carrying regarding our past association, I suggest you leave it at the door. I am rebuilding my life, and I need a clear foundation." That night, I locked myself in the small, forgotten study on the third floor, a room Julian had never bothered to renovate, still filled with dusty first editions and a worn leather armchair. I reread the terse letter from his doctors confirming the amnesia, the irreversible nature of the memory loss concerning the period following his 30th birthday. I clutched the small, tarnished silver key tucked into my locket, the key to our Tuscan chapel, and the silence of the vast apartment became a roaring accusation. I couldn't bear to be his housekeeper, his shadow, the constant reminder of a life he casually discarded. The next morning, I left a note on his immaculate mahogany desk. It was brief, professional, and utterly final. Mr. Thorne, I have tendered my resignation, effective immediately. All domestic matters have been concluded. Sincerely, E. Vance. I didn't wait for a reply. I took the emergency savings I had accumulated over the years, the money I'd earned while sacrificing my own career track, and I walked out of that gilded cage, trading penthouse views for a tiny, overpriced studio apartment miles away in Venice Beach, where the smell of salt and frying food replaced the scent of expensive leather and polished marble. For 6 months, I worked as a freelance editor, burying myself in other people's stories, trying to find the narrative threads that could mend my own shattered reality. I avoided all news pertaining to Julian Thorne Enterprises. I had to cut the cord completely, or I knew I would break. Then, the inevitable happened. The world, it seemed, was determined to keep Julian Thorne and Elara Vance inextricably linked. A high-profile tech conference in Silicon Valley required my former firm's attendance, and miraculously, my editor assigned me to provide last-minute fact-checking support for the press release materials. I tried to refuse, feigning illness, but the deadline was too tight. Stepping back into that rarefied atmosphere felt like walking into a vacuum. The security was tighter, the energy more frantic. I kept to the shadows, focusing solely on the glowing screen in front of me, trying to ignore the low thrum of anticipation in the air. And then, there he was. He strode onto the main stage, bathed in the spotlight, looking impossibly powerful, effortlessly commanding the attention of 5,000 industry leaders. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed molded to his frame. The amnesia hadn't dulled his charisma, if anything, it had sharpened it, stripping away any lingering softness and leaving pure, unadulterated focus. He was ruthless perfection. He launched into his presentation, detailing the next generation of AI integration, a concept Julian and I had brainstormed over lukewarm takeout pizza during a late night 6 years ago. Hearing his voice articulate our ideas he no longer attributed to the shared crucible of creation, was a fresh wave of nausea. During the Q&A, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal stood up. Mr. Thorne, there have been persistent rumors about your personal life leading up to the accident. Can you confirm the identity of the woman who, sources suggest, managed your private affairs and was purportedly involved in your life during that period? A hush fell over the auditorium. Julian paused, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at his notes, a gesture so familiar it felt like a punch to my diaphragm. I can confirm, Julian stated, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, that there was an assistant, Elara Vance. She was highly competent. She left my employment shortly before the accident, and I have no recollection of her, nor any personal relationship with her. The focus now is on the future, not on ancillary personnel from a forgotten past. Ancillary personnel. Forgotten past. I felt a strange detachment, as if watching a performance starring someone else. I should have been relieved. He had stated it clearly, officially closing the door. But instead, a sudden, violent surge of anger, hot and pure, erupted from the core of my exhaustion. This was not just about my feelings, it was about the erasure of his happiness, the rewriting of his character. He was projecting the cold façade of the man he thought he should be, not the warm, ambitious man he was. I didn't think. I simply reacted. I pushed away from my workstation, ignoring the frantic whispers of my supervisor, and marched toward the stage, my sensible heels clicking a sharp counterrhythm to the silence of the room. Security guards moved instantly, but I was faster, fueled by adrenaline and righteous fury. I reached the edge of the stage just as a guard reached for my arm. I shrugged him off with a surprising strength, planting my feet firmly on the riser. Mr. Thorne. My voice, usually low and controlled, sliced through the vast hall. Julian turned, his posture instantly defensive, confusion warring with annoyance. He saw me, not Elara the ghost, but Elara the woman who had once commanded his attention. Security. He barked, but I was already speaking, my breath catching in my throat. You say you have no memory, Mr. Thorne, I spat, every word aimed directly at the vacant space where recognition should have been. But you remember the details of your company, the structure of your wealth, the precise metrics of your success. You remember everything that made you powerful. You just conveniently forget the things that made you human. The auditorium was utterly still. Veronica Sterling, seated in the front row, looked horrified. Julian stepped away from the podium, his expression hardening into the mask of the betrayed CEO. This is highly unprofessional, Ms. Vance. I told you, I don't know you personally. You are causing a scene. A scene. I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. This isn't a scene, Julian. This is the cleanup crew arriving after you torched the only good thing in your life. Do you even remember Tuscany? The rainstorm that flooded the basement. The silver locket you gave me, claiming it was older than the Mona Lisa. His face remained perfectly blank, a testament to the thoroughness of the brain trauma. Tuscany. Locket. I have never been to Tuscany, and I detest jewelry. You are clearly mistaken, or perhaps attempting extortion. Extortion. The word hung there, vile and heavy. That was the final straw. The insult wasn't just to me, it was to the integrity of the man I had loved, the man who, in his amnesiac state, was choosing to believe the worst possible narrative about the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. I raised my hand, not intending to strike, only to emphasize the depth of my betrayal, but in that moment, something snapped. The years of forced composure, the agonizing silence, the sheer injustice of being dismissed, it all coalesced into a single, blinding need to make him feel something. My hand connected with his cheek with a sharp, stunning crack that echoed around the hall. It wasn't the force of the blow that shocked everyone, it was the sheer, unbelievable audacity of striking Julian Thorne on a public stage. Julian froze, not in pain, but in utter disbelief. His hand instinctively rose to his cheek, his polished façade finally cracking, revealing a flicker of raw astonishment. I stood there, panting, my hand stinging, realizing the monumental error I had just committed. I had just assaulted the most powerful man in the city. Get her off the stage. Julian finally roared, his voice laced with genuine fury this time, the first genuine emotion he'd shown toward me. The guards descended instantly, seizing my arms, dragging me backward. As they pulled me away, my eyes locked onto Julian's. He was staring at the spot where my hand had been, a deep furrow forming between his brows, a flicker of something indefinable, confusion, perhaps pain, perhaps the ghost of a memory crossing his features. I was escorted out, not gently, and within the hour, I was released on the condition that I never approach Julian Thorne again, or face immediate arrest for assault. I walked out of the corporate tower into the indifferent city traffic, feeling both utterly broken and strangely, morbidly free. I had burned the bridge entirely. For the next 2 weeks, I expected the lawsuit, the police report, the inevitable news cycle dissecting the assistant who snapped. But nothing came. The Thorne PR machine, I later realized, had worked overtime, spinning the incident as a minor, undisclosed medical emergency involving a disgruntled former employee who had since been dealt with privately. Julian Thorne did not tolerate public scandal. I returned to my small apartment, convinced I had seen the last of him. I tried to settle back into anonymity, but the memory of the sting of his cheek lingered, an irritating phantom limb. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the conference debacle, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. It wasn't security. It was Julian. Alone. He wasn't wearing a suit, he wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, looking less like a titan and more like a very lost, very wealthy man. I opened the door just a crack, bracing myself. Mr. Thorne, if this is about a restraining order, I assure you. Elara, he interrupted, his voice hoarse. He wasn't looking at my face, he was looking past me, as if trying to peer into the structure of the apartment itself. I need to see the apartment where you lived before the penthouse. I stared at him, dumbfounded. What? I haven't lived in the penthouse for over a year. And why would you possibly care about where I lived before that? The slap, he said, the word sounding alien on his tongue. It wasn't the pain. It was the look in your eyes. It wasn't rage, Elara. It was grief weaponized. And when I touched my face, there was a residual heat. A burn. I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see sunlight reflecting off glass, and I smell salt water, but I can't place it. He took a hesitant step forward, violating the invisible boundary I had desperately tried to maintain. I have spent the last 2 weeks doing things I never do. I hired a memory specialist, a specialist in trauma retrieval. I've been reviewing footage from the conference repeatedly. The way you looked at me when you spoke about Tuscany, it felt more real than anything I've experienced since I woke up. He seemed genuinely tormented. His eyes, usually so fiercely controlled, were wide and shadowed with sleepless nights. You said things, Elara. Things that don't fit the profile of a mere employee. A silver locket. Tuscany. I pulled my private financial records, the ones I hadn't reviewed since my recovery. There were recurring, large withdrawals labeled Tuscan property maintenance, dating back 5 years. And there was a purchase, a rather expensive engagement ring, that was never accounted for in any legal filing. My breath hitched. He was starting to dig, following the breadcrumbs I had scattered in my desperate outburst. Julian, stop this, I whispered, pressing my back against the doorframe. You are seeing ghosts because you were publicly humiliated. You are grasping for context, and I am the nearest available narrative. Forget it. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from my arm, an almost electrical hesitation in his movement. If I was grasping, Elara, I would have focused on Veronica Sterling. She's the one who commands boardroom respect, the one who stood where you stood. But I can't shake the feeling that if I let go of this ghost of you, I will lose the foundation of who I am supposed to be. He lowered his hand, defeated for a moment. I need proof, Elara. Something that doesn't come from your mouth or my scattered data. Something you can show me that confirms what I'm feeling, that I didn't just waste 5 years loving an ancillary personnel. The rain outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. Could I do it again? Could I subject myself to that scrutiny, that cold, analytical gaze that might still reject the truth? But seeing him like this, vulnerable, genuinely questioning the reality he inhabited, was a different kind of torment. The Julian I knew would never stand on my doorstep, drenched and pleading for a narrative. Come in, I said, my voice barely audible. The studio apartment was small, cluttered with books and half-finished editing projects, the antithesis of the antiseptic luxury he was used to. He walked slowly, touching nothing, his eyes wide with the sensory overload of actual life, not curated existence. I don't have the locket here, I admitted, leading him to the cramped living area. I keep it safe. Safe where? He asked, his tone urgent. Not here. I moved everything important out of the penthouse when I left. I wasn't planning on coming back to the wreckage. He nodded, processing. You knew I wouldn't remember. You prepared for this. I prepared for a future without you, Julian. Not a future where you treated me like a misplaced umbrella. I walked to a built-in shelf, behind a row of thick, unimportant textbooks, and pulled out a small, wooden box. It was simple pine, the kind you could buy at any tourist shop, but inside lay the remnants of our life. I opened it. Inside rested the tarnished silver locket, the miniature, slightly blurred photograph of us in Tuscany, Julian's arm slung loosely around my shoulders, both of us squinting against the unexpected Tuscan sun, and tucked beneath it, the heavy, antique key. I lifted the locket, the cool metal instantly warming in my palm. I held it out to him. Julian took it with the same almost fearful reverence he'd shown the empty air before. He didn't open it immediately. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the faint, nearly erased engraving on the back, J+E, forever. Forever, he repeated softly, the word tasting strange in his mouth. He looked at the photo, his brow furrowed in concentration. The woman. She looks happy. I look. He paused, searching for the right word. Unburdened. Then, he slowly pressed the clasp. The tiny hinges gave way, revealing the miniature portrait. He stared at the image of his former self, a man smiling openly, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way the current Julian never did. He looked at me in the photograph, his arm possessively around my waist. That's you, he murmured, not as a question, but as a statement of dawning, terrible realization. You're wearing the dress I hated. I blinked. You hated the coral dress? You told me it brought out the gold flecks in my eyes. Julian shook his head, a sudden, sharp movement that seemed to cause him physical pain. No, I loved that dress. I told Veronica Sterling I hated it because she kept asking why I bought it for you. I told her I hated it to create a distance she couldn't penetrate. He looked up at me then, truly seeing me for the first time since the accident. The memory wasn't flooding back in a rush of cinematic flashbacks, it was seeping in through the cracks of his logical fortress, one agonizing truth at a time, triggered by the texture of shared history. Veronica, he whispered, his voice laced with dawning horror. She was there when I woke up. She's been handling all my personal affairs since the hospital. The implications hit us simultaneously. While Julian had been convalescing and rebuilding his life based on the narrative handed to him by his closest confidant, that confidant had been strategically isolating him, replacing the inconvenient, messy reality of Elara Vance with the polished, manageable fiction of Veronica Sterling. She told me you left abruptly, overwhelmed by the accident, I confessed, the shame of my quiet retreat flooding back. She implied that our relationship, the one I cherished, was simply too much pressure for me. Julian slowly lowered the locket, his hands trembling. He looked around the tiny apartment, his gaze finally settling on the worn leather armchair, a chair that was similar in shape, though vastly inferior in quality, to the one in his study. I remember the texture of the Tuscan sun on my skin, he said, his voice gaining a strange, nascent authority. I remember arguing with you about which vineyard to buy. I remember the sound of your laughter when I tried to make pasta and flooded the kitchen. It wasn't a ghost, Elara. It was me. He took another step, closing the remaining distance between us. He reached out again, this time not hesitating, and placed his hand flat against my cheek, right where I had struck him weeks prior. His touch was gentle, reverent, the complete opposite of the jarring force I had inflicted. When you hit me, he breathed, leaning his forehead against mine, it wasn't the pain that stunned me. It was the familiarity of the anger. It was the intensity of the connection. No one else in the world has ever looked at me with that much fire, that much right to confront me. He closed his eyes, and I could feel the deep, seismic shift happening within him. He wasn't just remembering facts, he was reconnecting with the emotional context of those facts. I was cold, he choked out, the billionaire façade finally shattering under the weight of his self-realization. I was impenetrable. Veronica built an empire of lies around me, and I welcomed the structure because it was easier than remembering the beautiful chaos we shared. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, raw and exposed. The man looking at me now was Julian, my Julian, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he had lost and then compounded by what he had done. Elara, he said, the sound of my name on his lips now carrying the full weight of 5 years of shared life. I hurt you. I dismissed you. I let a predator take the reins of my life because the truth was too hard to hold on to. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping, the raw devastation washing over his features. I deserve whatever hatred you have for me. I deserve to be sued, denounced, ruined. But what I don't deserve is this emptiness. He gestured around the small room, encompassing the whole scene. This void where you should be. He sank onto the edge of my worn sofa, the expensive fabric of his sweater looking ridiculously out of place against the faded upholstery. He put his head in his hands, and I heard a sound, a low, guttural groan of self-reproach that tore through the quiet room. I remember the proposal, he whispered into his hands. Under the olive tree. It was raining, and I had just lost the bid for that overseas contract. I was furious. You didn't try to cheer me up. You just handed me a bottle of cheap Chianti and told me to mourn the deal before celebrating the marriage. Tears were beginning to track paths through the grime and exhaustion on my own face. He was finding the threads. Julian, you were furious, I reminded him gently. You were ready to walk away from the negotiation entirely. And you stopped me, he murmured, looking up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. You said, you can destroy the deal, Julian, but don't destroy the man I married in the process. That's what she never understood. She only saw the deal. He stood up abruptly, his entire demeanor shifting from broken victim to resolute man. He didn't stride with the cold authority of the CEO, he moved with the determined focus of a man reclaiming his soul. I need to make this right, he stated, his voice firm. I need to see the chapel. I need to know everything that happened in those 2 years I erased. I need you to tell me every slight, every moment of neglect, every time I failed you, because I need to feel the weight of what I did. He walked toward me, his gaze unwavering, demanding the truth, demanding the pain. I forgive you for forgetting, Julian, I managed, shaking my head, the contradiction tearing at me. But I cannot forgive you for the cruelty of the forgetting. The way you dismissed me. Don't say you forgive me, he cut in sharply, gripping my shoulders, his touch solid and real. Don't give me absolution before I've earned the right to beg for it. I don't want easy forgiveness. I want the catalogue of my sins. I want to know exactly how many times I inflicted that cold indifference on you. He let go, stepping back as if struck by a sudden, profound insight. The slap, he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible tone of absolute horror. You were right to do it. You were right to lash out. You were standing in front of the entire world, and I treated you like a functionary. I treated you with contempt when you were my entire history. He ran both hands through his hair, a gesture of pure, unadulterated self-loathing. I remember now, in fragments. The silence after the accident wasn't just trauma, it was an agonizing blank spot where you should have been holding my hand. When I woke up and saw Veronica, I clung to her because she was easy. She offered a neat, empty life, and I was too afraid to face the depth of the love I had forgotten. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if testing their reality. I was afraid of the man who loved you so much he married you in secret, because that man was vulnerable. The amnesiac Julian was just the CEO. The man who loved you was the whole, flawed man. He looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears, an expression of utter devastation that far surpassed the cold anger he'd shown on stage. Elara, he began, and the intensity of his voice made my knees weak. I drove you away when I had no memory. I dismissed the only real thing in my life because I was too cowardly to accept the memory of profound happiness. And when you finally lashed out, when you made me feel something sharp enough to pierce the fog, I still defaulted to suspicion. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I was a monster to you. I was a fool who threw away a masterpiece for a blueprint. And then, the ultimate act of penance, an action so raw and self-flagellating that it overshadowed the public slap I had delivered weeks before. Julian Thorne, the man whose net worth was measured in the tens of billions, whose reputation was built on iron control and infallible precision, sank to his knees on the threadbare rug of my cramped studio apartment. He didn't look up at me. He stared at the dusty floorboards, his posture speaking volumes of his self-condemnation. I don't know how to ask for forgiveness when I don't even remember earning it, he choked out, his voice thick with genuine remorse. But I can feel the guilt, Elara. I can feel the enormity of the wound I inflicted on you, even if the memories are still fighting their way back. He raised his head slightly, and I saw the horrifying sight that confirmed the depth of his internalized self-punishment. His knuckles were white, his face contorted not with theatrical grief, but with a deep, agonizing internal conflict. When I heard the reports, the gossip, about your outburst on stage, he continued, his voice strained, my immediate thought was not about the PR nightmare. It was, she finally let go. And the thought of you finally letting go of me, even the memory of me, was unbearable. He paused, took a rattling breath, and then, in a gesture that was both ancient and horribly modern, he raised his own hand. His eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding my face, unwilling to see the witness to his shame. "I told you I needed clarity," he whispered, the sound almost lost in the traffic noise filtering in from the street. "I found the clarity. I drove you away because I was a stranger who assumed the worst. I hurt you. I insulted the love we shared." And then, with a terrible, deliberate force, Julian Thorne slammed the flat of his own open palm against his cheek. It wasn't a light tap. It was a loud, sharp crack, mirroring the sound I had made weeks earlier, but filled with a profound, self-directed agony. He didn't flinch externally, but I could see the tremor run through his body. He waited a beat, his face expressionless, then repeated the action. Crack. A second self-inflicted strike, this one perhaps slightly harder. He continued this agonizing ritual. Crack. 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 He wasn't counting. He was punishing the man who had forgotten, the man who had chosen oblivion over true connection, the man who had allowed his power to isolate him from the only love that mattered. He struck his cheek again and again, the sound echoing in the small room, each impact a testament to his realization of the massive, arrogant mistake he had made by discarding the inconvenient truth of his past. I stood frozen, watching the billionaire punish himself in my tiny living room, not for a business failure, but for the failure of his heart. I watched him strike himself until his skin was flushed red, until the sting was so evident on his face that the physical manifestation of his remorse was undeniable. He struck himself because he was punishing the amnesiac Julian for being a dismissive stranger, and he was punishing the recovering Julian for being too slow to piece the truth together. He was striking himself 1,000 times over for the casual contempt he'd shown the woman he once loved enough to marry in secret. Finally, Julian stopped. His breath came in ragged gasps. His cheek was already blooming with angry redness, a stark contrast to the pristine perfection he usually maintained. He stayed kneeling, unable to meet my eyes, the silence filled only by his heavy breathing. "I don't deserve your presence," he managed, his voice raw, stripped bare of all artifice. "But I have to ask you to stay. Stay long enough for me to remember every minute I wasted. Stay long enough for me to earn the right to apologize to the man I was, by being better for the man I am now." He looked up then, his eyes red-rimmed, not from crying, but from the sheer force of his self-recrimination. "Tell me what to do, Elara," he pleaded, his posture one of complete surrender. "I will dedicate the rest of my life, the life I remember and the life I'm rediscovering, to proving that the man you married in Tuscany is still here, beneath the wreckage." The anger that had sustained me for 2 years finally evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, overwhelming tenderness for this broken, powerful man who was finally seeing the scope of his devastation. He hadn't just forgotten me, he had forgotten how to feel until I had slapped him, and then, in a grotesque inversion of roles, he had slapped himself until he remembered the capacity for pain and love. "Get up, Julian," I said, my own voice cracking. I stepped forward and knelt beside him, ignoring the rough feel of the rug beneath my knees. I reached out and gently touched the angry red patch on his cheek, the spot where my anger had first made contact, and where his remorse now manifested physically. "You don't need to punish yourself anymore," I whispered. "The punishment isn't the beating, Julian. The punishment was the silence, the cold, the dismissal. And you just ended that. Now, we start slow. We start with the chapel key." I took the antique key from the box and placed it firmly in his palm, closing his fingers around it. "We go to Tuscany," I told him, looking into the eyes that were slowly, painfully, beginning to remember me. "And you listen. You listen to every story I have to tell about the man I married. And when you remember enough to feel even half of what I felt when you left, then, maybe, we can talk about forgiveness." Julian Thorne, the Titan, nodded once, clutching the small, tarnished key as if it were the most valuable asset in his multi-billion-dollar portfolio. The chill in the air was finally gone, replaced by the fragile, tentative warmth of a foundation being rebuilt, not on sterile perfection, but on the shared memory of sun-drenched rainstorms and the agonizing, necessary sting of truth. The forgotten wife was remembered, not by a miracle, but by the sheer force of a billionaire's self-inflicted penance. And I knew, standing there in the cramped, ordinary light of my studio, that the real story, the arduous journey of reclamation, was only just beginning.